one of the main witnesses, his name is Herman Douglas. And, I just wanted to select out a couple portions of his testimony because it's helpful to see, what his involvement was and the insight that he had to provide. And so Mr. Douglas, he's from LA, 46 years old, from South LA. They continue to mention South LA. What does he do? So he actually had different jobs within some of Nipsey's businesses. And so in the beginning of his testimony, they're just kind of walking through his relationship. So he says, hey man, like, we were just good friends. It was like almost like a father-son relationship. It was just, we were really good friends. They had met back in 2003. And so he was working at these stores and just kind of doing odd jobs there. And so they're kind of laying the foundation for the relationship between him and Nipsey. And so here he's talking about how sometimes, when Nipsey would actually show up to the businesses. So there were some months when, it basically at least once a month, he would come through and check up on the businesses. And, he would, like I said, he would meet fans, he would take pictures, again, a man of the people. And again, he emphasizes that when Nipsey would come up, he didn't really have security with him. He didn't have security. And that just kind of goes to show, for him, a lot of times when you see rappers and they go back to where they came from or go to another city, they'll have security with them. I just found it really interesting that Nipsey didn't roll around with security. So anyhow, they start to talk about, March 31st, right? And at a certain point, a dude he knows is Shitty. So Eric Holder, his nickname was Shitty. And so they called him Shitty, cuz. And I just like, I'm sorry, man. You'd have had to give me a different name. I couldn't go by Shitty. But they say at some point, so Shitty rose up, right? And so this Mr. Douglas mentions, hey, he's a former member of Rolling 60s, and he knew Nipsey was a member of Rolling 60s. He knew Eric Holder was a member of Rolling 60s. So this wasn't like a beef between gang rivals or anything like that. All of these guys were from the same hood. And so Nipsey had recognized him. And so they saw him in the car. And so Nipsey says, hey, is that Shitty? When he sees him going by. And we'll come to find out that he hadn't been around for a while, right? And so they see him in the passenger seat of a car, and then he comes up. So at some point he ended up going to the Master Burger. He went to get food, and then he ends up going to this group. So Nipsey's there, Douglas is there, and a couple other people are there. And Nipsey comes up. He didn't have a shirt on, which is interesting as well. Sometimes you see cats just walking around with no shirt. I couldn't do that unless I'm just at the beach, but hey, that's how some folks get down. So, so they have him identified. Do you recognize this person? Okay, that's Shitty. All right. And so they're asking him, all right, well, how long were you there before Holder gets there? So he was there about 30, 40 minutes before Holder rose up. And so that whole time he was never away from Nipsey. So he was there basically the whole time. Right. And so Nipsey or Holder ends up coming up, and they're asking, okay, well, what was Nipsey's demeanor like right before Holder pulls up? And so he said, well, hey, we were having a good conversation. We're talking about he just did a video a couple days ago. We're talking about his career. He had just been in the studio. So things are up. All right. So they're reminiscing about old times. And he signed a couple autographs, took some pictures. And so, just basically being his normal self. And so then they're asking, all right, well, so did his demeanor change when Holder pulled up? And he says no. Douglas says no. This his demeanor didn't change at all. And so, but what came up was this conversation about his paperwork. And so, he says Nipsey was looking out for him, basically saying, hey, they got paperwork on you. He said, I haven't read it. So basically, this was something that Nipsey had apparently heard from around the way, that there's word out there that Holder had been snitching, right? And so again, this wasn't like a it wasn't a hostile situation. It's just a conversation. And so Nipsey was basically saying, hey, you need to handle that. All right, so there's these rumors going around. And so then the prosecutor asks, well, what does that mean? What is the significance of someone saying that there's paperwork on you? And so he's saying, well, when you have a case and when you go to jail or when you get out, then a lot of times people will want to see the documents to see whether, you were an informant, were you cooperating, anything like that. Because if you were, that can be problematic. All right. So here they're saying, hey, if a gang member says to another gang member, you better be careful because, there's some paperwork or saying that you told or you snitched. What they're referring to is police reports or some type of court documents that show that the person was cooperating with the police or maybe told something about gang business or a crime or something like that. Right. And so again, Nipsey was telling Holder, hey, you better address that or take care of that. And so what he's saying is like, you need to go and check whoever is basically spreading these words about you. Right. And so that's definitely something that you would want to address because it's something major in the hood. If people are talking about, okay, well, how you came home early, right? So if you were supposed to do 15 or you're supposed to do 20 years or you're supposed to do a certain amount of time and you end up coming home after a few months or after a couple of years, then people are going to think, man, what did he do? How's he coming home early? So he must have talked, right? And so that's a serious ordeal. And so then they start asking again, boom, why would you need to clear that up? Because, okay, in gang culture, snitching is not a good thing to do. And they ask, okay, well, what are some of the consequences that can flow from somebody who snitches? And Holder was honest. He said it could be anything from getting beat up to getting killed. And so there was no conversation from Nipsey towards Holder in terms of what specifically was snitched about. They didn't mention any names. They didn't mention any particular cases. There was, there really wasn't any particular context. All right. And so the interesting thing, again, there being no disrespect in this conversation. It just really seemed very matter of fact and to the point. It wasn't anything, that alarming. But here's and so, after Nipsey brings that up, after Nipsey's like, hey, I've heard, you, and this is something that you need to go out and address, but they're saying that you might have been snitching. And so Shitty responds like, nah, they're just hating on me. I didn't snitch on nobody. They're just hating on me. And so Nip says, so just so you know what I'm talking about. And again, Holder's like, nah, they're just hating on me. But the interesting thing is he looked. So Douglas is testifying. He's like, hey, have you heard my rap? Basically, have you heard my new song? He's like, yeah, I've been in the studio. This is Holder talking. He's like, I've been in the studio. I did my new song. Have you heard it? And they were like, nah, we haven't heard it. So, and so then after that, he says, all right, well, then we shook hands. And then, he might have took off right after that. And so I was just kind of thinking about this because it seemed like, and I don't think that they mentioned this in the closing argument, But when we're looking at this situation of Nipsey bringing up, have you been snitching, or word on the street is that you've been snitching. Okay, so he's, again, it from the witness testimony, it didn't appear that he was that he was being antagonistic about, about this warning. It was more, him being cool about it. But the interesting thing is, when you think about haters, right? When you think about jealousy, Nipsey Hussle at this point is known all over the world, right? So he's reached legendary status at this point. But him and Holder, they're from the same hood. They're from the same set. And somehow Nipsey, again, is famous. He's got, this strip mall. He's got his own businesses. He's got people lining up to sign autographs, to take pictures with him, to have a word with him, because he's this beloved figure in the community. And Shitty comes up and is like, yo, have you heard my music? And they're like, nah, we haven't heard it. So when we're trying to figure out motive, like why did this happen? That's an interesting thing. Was that possibly something that set him over the edge, where somebody just cannot stand to see another brother successful and decide to take his life? It's just something interesting to think about and keep in the back of our minds. And realistically, we may not get the answer to that. Some folks may know, but we may not necessarily get the answer from that, because Holder may or may not take the stand. I don't think there's been any indication as to whether he's going to take the stand, and he doesn't have to make that decision. Really, he doesn't have to make that decision until it's the defense attorneys, or it's the defense's opportunity to present their evidence. And then at that point, they will have to decide whether Holder ends up taking the stand or not. But I think that's a big point that ultimately we have to look at, because as we sit here and try and put the pieces together regarding this senseless tragedy, and we're looking at a conversation that between everybody who was standing there basically said it wasn't anything crazy. It didn't, people weren't yelling, people weren't, just, getting crazy. It was just a matter of fact conversation, but then that leads to this. So again, and the interesting thing is, what Douglas testifies to is he says, listen, when he started mentioning the songs that he was recording, he says, I looked at him and he just looked kind of weird. He's like, I didn't know, maybe he was high, he might have been high or whatever it may be. And so then that ends up becoming another factor, another layer to this. So was he, being high, maybe he misinterpreted this situation. Maybe he went a little further than obviously, in terms of deciding to shoot somebody, but just in his mind, the conversation that Nipsey was having with him in terms of this allegation or this accusation or these rumors going around about him snitching. And then on top of that, being slighted, right? Being slighted, he's standing here and seeing everything that's surrounding Nipsey. And then, kind of asking, yo, you hear my music? And they're like, nah, we didn't hear it. That just might have been enough to set him over the top while being high and being like, okay, well, interpreting that as disrespect. And we all know what can happen when people feel disrespected. When people feel disrespected, they can start fights. They can, pull out a knife, pull out a gun. And apparently that's what ultimately led to this. So again, we have this testimony here, and just kind of moving right along here. I'm gonna skip down because there's a lot of information that is important that ultimately will be important. But in terms of going through this, because we could spend multiple hours going through this, but I want to get you the just the most relevant testimony. But when we get here, so this gentleman, he ends up actually going into the break room, because again, remember, he works at these shops. And so after they have their conversation. So, Holder ends up leaving. He ends up going in. So he says, I walked into the Marathon store. I walked around the counter. And then when I got to the break room, I sat down with my salad and I heard the gunshots. I heard maybe a few gunshots. He ran out. So he didn't actually see the shooting take place because he had already walked back inside. But then when he comes out, then that's when he sees Nipsey on the ground and he sees Holder running. And he sees him run, and there's the white car, and that's the car that Holder ultimately takes off in.